Oink for your trough full of slop, you grubby little piggies. History class is back in session, and I'm the fucking daddy around here. Welcome back to the second season of Archives of Atrocity. Once again, I'm your host, Big Daddy John, and joining me as always is my co-host, four-legged friend, and professional bacon strip smuggler, El Chato. We got an absolute ripper of a show for you today, folks. In this second season, we'll be diving into some of the most infamous cults and sects throughout history. But first, a little housekeeping. Last season was my first attempt at making a podcast, and I mean like literally ever. I was stressing a bit and trying to make sure all my ducks were in a row so I could record the episodes and have them out. But in my haste, I may have overlooked a few things. For one thing, I committed a cardinal sin. I omitted the one thing every historical podcast, and for that matter, anybody purporting any factual information should have. I forgot to cite my sources, so mea culpa. But as of this episode, all sources will be cited, and you can read them in the description right there. So feel free to double check my homework before the dog eats it. And here's something else you might have noticed about the description. You see that warning in big bold fuck off letters? Well, there's a reason for that. Somebody who I'm not going to name chewed me out about some of the lewd content of my podcast and suggested that I should have warnings. So, fair enough. And after all, won't somebody please think of the children? Now, while I've always tried to keep this podcast clean, family-friendly, and in a manner that glorifies the Lord, I'm afraid my co-host has a bit of a potty mouth sometimes. Don't you take that tone with me, young man. I've seen you eat cat poo out of the litter box and go back for seconds. So if nothing else, don't say I didn't warn you. But if you are a kid listening to this, you probably shouldn't be. But on the other hand, there's much worse things you could be doing with your time. And lastly, as you may have noticed, I'm going to be taking a bit of a different tack with this podcast. Initially, I wanted Archives of Atrocity to be a crossover between history and true crime, but truth be told, there's an absolute glut of true crime podcasts, and many of them do it a hell of a lot better than I ever could, so go listen to them. Two of my favorites are Red Handed and All Killer No Filler. Tell them Big Daddy John sent you. For some reason, everything just sounds better when it's spoken by English chicks. Case in point, Morrigan the Witch from the first Dragon Age game, voiced by the divine Claudia Black. Oh Morrigan, fetch me a dream. So in summary, while I'm always going to be covering all the weird, wonderful, depraved and perverted shit us human beings do to one another, I'm going to be leaning into the history side of it a lot more. So from now on, because it's my damn podcast and I said so, this is a history podcast. But it ain't your grandmama's history podcast, that's for damn sure. Just remember, fellow archivists, history doesn't just belong to stuffy old professors in tweed jackets. It belongs to all of us, even a drunken, lecherous reprobate such as myself. And there you have it. That, as they say, is that, as far as housekeeping goes. But anyway, it's been a hell of a day for yours truly. I'd stopped in at the BP to get some vegan sausage rolls, and I was walking back home when I walked past the construction site. As I was walking past, a dude 3 stories up on the scaffolding dropped a brick, and it landed square on my cranium. So I came to a couple of minutes later and checked myself for any kind of damage. I had a bit of a head wound, and my vision was a bit blurry, but otherwise I was fine and dandy. And hell, at least I got a free brick out of the deal. So while I don't think I've got any Dane bramage going on, the doctor says I ain't been right in the head since them aliens abducted me, gang probed me, and put that chip in my brain. But anywho, how the hell are you, Chato? What's on your mind today? Anybody in particular, or just in general? And how am I supposed to tell who the bad people are? Well, okie dokie then. We got a few errands to run later, but I suppose we can pencil that in. But anyway, where the hell are my manners? We got a podcast to do, so let's crack into this motherfucker. As I mentioned before, this series is going to be about cults and sects from history. But before we crack into it, let's talk definitions. What do we mean when we talk about cults and sects? Usually when we refer to sects, we're talking about a subgroup or offshoot of an existing larger religion. Sometimes one with more extreme or radical views. A cult, on the other hand, can be indistinguishable from a very radical sect, or it could be entirely different, created out of whole cloth. Some of the hallmarks of a cult are a very extreme in-group mentality, severe restrictions placed upon the adherents, and oftentimes an obsessive veneration and sometimes worship of the founder or leader. But I've wasted enough of your goddamn time already, so I'm not going to get too bogged down into definitions of cults and sects. But if you want to learn more, I'd recommend a YouTube channel called Telltale Atheist. The dude's an ex-Jehovah's Witness, and he breaks it down a hell of a lot better than I ever could. So with that in mind, let's roll up the first one of the series, the Cult of the Aten. While the ancient Egyptians may not have been the first established human society, one could argue that they were absolutely the first nation or country. While the Sumerians may have come first, Sumeria was a loose conglomeration of independent city-states. Around 3150 BC, a king named Narmer from the Second Dynasty unified all the independent cities, towns, and villages of Egypt. Narmer would become the first archetypical pharaoh that later pharaohs would model themselves on. While a pharaoh had all the powers and responsibilities we would traditionally associate with a king, the pharaoh was also seen as the highest priest in the land, as well as a living god and an object of religious veneration and worship. To say that ancient Egypt was very important to world history would be a gross understatement. The Nile River was the lifeblood of Egypt. Every year the Nile would flood, leaving rich nutrients and silk along the banks. And with this, the Egyptians had the distinction of growing more food with less manpower than anybody in history. This enabled them not only to support a large population, but also to become very wealthy, exporting the grain to other nations in the Mediterranean. Indeed, Rome itself was dependent on Egyptian grain. Anytime the shipments were interrupted, the empire faced starvation. The Egyptians also pioneered many innovations in the fields of mathematics, geometry, astronomy, writing, and medicine. They also utilized a 365-day calendar based on the flooding of the Nile. They were also the first nation to implement a sophisticated taxation system, once again based on the annual inundations of the Nile. They also gave the world such things as dentistry, toothpaste, surgical instruments, unionized labor, black ink, high heels, and believe it or not, bowling. They also built many wondrous monuments, some of which stand to this very day. And I can't even fucking believe I have to say this. And I know you all are cool, smart people, but it has to be clarified for all the dum-dums out there. But the Great Pyramids were absolutely, and I repeat, absolutely not built by aliens. You fucking ignoramuses. We have very good explanations of how the pyramids were built, and remember when I mentioned unionized labor? That shit built the pyramids. Every single block of stone you see is there because a unionized worker put it there. And quite frankly, as someone who's got an amateur interest in Egyptology, you wouldn't believe how many times I've run into the whole aliens built the pyramids bullshit. 9 times out of 10, it comes down to a colossal argument from ignorance. Even though I haven't done any research, and I know nothing about the history and culture. I can't understand how the pyramids were built. Therefore, aliens! And while it's true that aliens may travel halfway across the universe to abduct, gang probe, and put chips in the brains of individuals such as myself, they didn't come here to build giant stone tombs, all of which would end up getting robbed. And if you go a little further into the desert, you can kind of see the evolution of the pyramid, starting from the simple mastaba tomb, to the step pyramid, to the bent pyramid, and finally to the Great Pyramids of Giza. And interestingly enough, the Sahara Desert is also littered with many failed attempts at pyramids. So sit on that and rotate clockwise, you New Age cretins. 1,000 years later, Egypt finds itself embroiled in civil war. Egypt was divided, as it always was historically, between Lower Egypt in the north and Upper Egypt in the south, which is not only confusing as shit, but straight up false advertising. During the civil wars, Upper and Lower Egypt were ruled by two different pharaohs. The civil wars lasted for about 150 years, after which, sometime around 2000 BC, the country was finally reunified by a pharaoh named Mentuhotep II of the 11th dynasty. And if we step into the time machine once again and zap forward 650 odd years, we find ourselves in the 18th dynasty, under the rule of a pharaoh named Amenhotep III. As far as pharaohs went, Amenhotep III was a pretty shit-hot pharaoh, and definitely one of the better ones. Although objectively speaking, it can be hard to tell who the good pharaohs were, because every single pharaoh got his ass kissed. Believe it or not, there are not many writings on papyrus scrolls to the effect of, "Oh, this pharaoh's shit. He changed all the animal registration laws. So now every year with the flooding of the Nile, I have to go down to the city council and fork up 2 pounds of grain for a new license. And then they give me this wooden scarab which I put on my dog's collar. But what they don't tell me is the scarab contains a microchip, which they use to read my dog's thoughts." And if that kind of thing's going on here and now in Christchurch, there's some poor bastard out there whose job it is to sit in front of a monitor and read Chatto's thoughts, which I can only imagine is a never-ending loop of anthropomorphic dancing sausages, bacon strips, and pizza slices. And so it was that Amenhotep III kept peace with all his neighbouring nations and built up a lot of wealth for Egypt's coffers. He was also a very prolific builder, and in fact, we have more surviving statues of Amenhotep III than any other pharaoh, including Ramses the Great, who was a prolific builder and shameless self-promoter. Amenhotep III had 6 children that we know of. He had 4 daughters, Setamun, Iset, Henuteneb, and Nebeta. He also had 2 sons, Thutmose and Amenhotep IV. But first, because it's absolutely crucial to this story, let's give you a little primer on religion in ancient Egypt. While the Egyptians had absolutely squillions of gods, there were 2 gods at this point who stood chief among all. Even under unification, Egypt was always divided between Upper and Lower Egypt. Each of the 2 regions had its own primary god, and as important as they were, these gods were never worshipped to the exclusion of the other gods, or as they referred to them, the Netjeru, which is the plural of gods. In Lower Egypt in the north, God damn it, Egypt, you suck at geography. The principal god was the god Ra, also known as Re, but I'm going to pronounce it Ra, because A comes before E, except after C. And if you're ever having trouble identifying the notes on the treble clef and remembering where they are, just remember this simple acronym. Every good boy deserves fellatio. According to Egyptian theology, Ra created literally everything, including all the other gods. And indeed, it was thought that all the other gods were aspects of the god Ra. And much like the god Horus, Ra had a falcon head, and as the other gods were thought to be aspects of him, His name was often combined with that of other gods, such as Amun-Ra, Ra-Hurakti, and so forth. First and foremost, Ra was the god of the sun. During the daytime, Ra would wake up with morning wood and get on his morning barge to travel across the sky. Behind him, he hauled the sun disk, or the Aten, across the sky. In the hieroglyphs, the Aten was represented as a disk with extending rays. In the nighttime, Ra entered the realm of the Duat, which was both the 12 hours of night and the literal hell of the Egyptian religion. Here in the Duat, Ra would battle the monstrous serpent Apep every night. Apep, also known as Apophis by the Greeks. Apep would attempt to consume the lunar barge every night, or stop it in its tracks with his hypnotic stare. And so every new day was thought to be another victory over Apep by the god Ra. The center of worship for Ra was in a city known as Heliopolis by the Greeks, which translates to City of the Sun, and stands in modern-day Cairo. In the south and Upper Egypt, the principal god was Amun, also known as the Hidden One. Amun had a human form with blue skin, representing the blue sky. Much like Ra, Amun was identified as a creator god, a solar god, and a god of fertility. Amun's center of worship was at Karnak Temple in the city of Thebes. Around 1950 BC, a pharaoh named Amenemhet, the founder of the 12th dynasty, whose name translated roughly into Amun is foremost, was the first pharaoh to incorporate Amun into his name. To further stress unification, he moved the capital to the city of Memphis, which was a meeting point between Upper and Lower Egypt. He named his new capital Ejaculate, which roughly translates to Caesar of the Two Lands. And by Caesar, I don't mean the guy that busted sweet nuts in Cleopatra. I mean Caesar as in the guy who grabs things, with his big old hairy meat spiders. Amenemhet glued Amun and Ra together, much like my bed sheets, which I can now snap in half, and made them into the singular deity of Amun-Ra, who was named King of the Gods. With Memphis now being the administrative capital, Thebes became the principal religious capital. The Temple of Karnak became the largest temple complex in Egypt, and was the Egyptian answer to England's Peppa Pig world. Amun-Ra became the principal god of Egypt for over 600 years. The temple complex of Karnak expanded significantly between 1500 and 1350 BC, under the rule of the 18th dynasty, who loved themselves some Amun-Ra. And from the temples of Karnak, divine oracles directed the pharaohs to conquer neighboring lands. Tribute and booty poured in from the conquered lands, and the temple of Amun-Ra was a major recipient. And as far as I'm concerned, you keep the tribute. Let all the booty pour in. And Colombian pop singer Shakira will start with you. The priesthood of Amun-Ra not only paid no taxes on the grain they grew on their lands, but were also able to sell any excess grain for a huge profit. And with all this wealth pouring in, the priesthood of Amun-Ra became one of the richest and most powerful forces in Egypt, with a power and a sphere of influence that almost rivaled the pharaoh, reaching the zenith of its power under the reign of Amenhotep III. Amenhotep III's successor was Thutmose, his oldest son. While we have very little information about the life of Thutmose, we do know he served as a priest of Ptah, the patron of craftsmen and architects in the city of Memphis. Strangely enough, Thutmose is best remembered for the limestone sarcophagus of his cat, Taimu. So I guess you could say he was a real pussy pleaser. Thanks, folks. I'll be here all week. Try the Cajun wedges. And while we have no record of exactly how Prince Thutmose died, we do know he died early. And so succession was passed to his youngest son, Amenhotep IV. While the records are a little hazy, Amenhotep IV probably ascended to the throne in his mid-teens, around the time Amenhotep III died in the 38th year of his reign. And while we don't have a record of whether it happened before or after he ascended to the throne, Amenhotep IV was married to Nefertiti. If you've seen any of the ubiquitous busts of Nefertiti, you'll know that she was one smoking hot piece of ass. I would have eaten that pussy with a knife and fork, which now that I think about it, doesn't really sound like it'd be much fun for anyone, and will probably be another awkward trip to the emergency room, and God knows I don't need any more of those. During his reign, he also took a secondary wife, Kaya, who was thought to be the mother of Tutankhamun. Amenhotep IV and Nefertiti would go on to have 6 daughters, which is not really a surprise, because if I had a hot trophy wife like Nefertiti, I would be absolutely emptying my nuts into her every last chance I got. And while we're on the subject of ejaculation, here's an interesting piece of trivia. At least once in his life, every pharaoh was expected to ejaculate into the Nile River. So if you ever visit Egypt, think about that when you decide to go for a swim. And so every pharaoh would have to stand on the banks of the Nile and beat his cock absolutely black and blue while a priest watched to make sure he did it right. The ritual was thought to renew and rejuvenate the Nile River. And I'm a little disappointed, because all I ever got from spilling my trouser yogurt in front of a priest was a bag of fruit bursts. He said to me, "Hey, if I give you some fruit bursts, will you come in the confessional booth?" To which I replied, "If you give me the whole bag, I'll come on your face." Aren't you glad I put that content warning in place? Like I said, not your grandmama's history podcast. And even though we've barely scratched the surface, I think this is a good place to leave it for now, because this is a long-ass story. So although we leave the land of the pharaohs for now, we'll be back tomorrow. And with that, here endeth the history lesson. Although I apologize for the week-long delay, I just want to thank all you fellow archivists for climbing aboard once again. This is my first ever 2-parter, and I've put more work into this one than I have any of the others. So I hope the delay was worth it, and I hope my effort paid off. And because I don't want to leave you with too bad a case of blue balls, part 2 is coming out tomorrow, so stay tuned. As I mentioned last season, I want to kick this particular season up a gear, so let me know how I'm doing. You can contact me at archivesofatrocity@gmail.com, and be sure to check out the official Archives of Atrocity Facebook page. And although I did create an official Archives of Atrocity Instagram page, it's just kind of there gathering dust, because Instagram sucks, and I don't see the point of it. And as much as I'm sure some of you would like to @ me, you'll never get the chance, because fuck Twitter. I hated Twitter long before the big orange man baby came along and ruined it. So although I'll never say never, it's very unlikely there will ever be an official Archives of Atrocity Twitter account. But the good news is the horrible, horrible people at Apple approved this podcast, so you can now check it out on Apple Podcasts. So be sure to tune back in tomorrow, where we have a very special guest come to help us out. So once again, this is John and Shadow sending out an SOS, apparently, but nonetheless signing off and signing out for another episode. See you folks next time.